We have two speakers whose names and biograms are known to you. Let me only remind you that Professor Jedlicki. No, excuse me, that was not entirely true. Okay, so he chaired the underground seminar, a flying university, in the years 1976-1981. From the educational viewpoint, it was one of the most important things that ever happened to me in my life. A wonderful community, a wonderful condition of the Polish humanist sciences thrown out from the world of universities. Karolina Wigura is a PhD student of mine, and I must say that she is proud, and I am proud of her work, The Blame of Nations, which received a number of very prestigious awards, including that of the Minister of Education and Higher Learning. And I must say that we also were holding home seminars for many years, but not under times of war. Well, you actually ran those seminars. Well, we ran them together. So I do believe that what we have here are two generations. We have Professor Jedlicki, the wartime generation, and Karolina Wigura, an intellectual, spiritual grandchild of that generation. We shall be talking about Europe in the context of Jews, and I would like to ask Professor Jedlicki to start to deliver a paper on whether the Holocaust was a unique development in the history of European civilization. Well, with regard to the topic itself, I must say that it is definitely a unique experience in European history, and I understood the topic as a question, whether the Holocaust is a unique or rather potentially multiple experience. Today, we tend to believe that the Holocaust was a sequence of events so incredible, so monstrous, that nothing in the history of mankind can be compared with it. Even the attempt to do it is not right, because any comparison with the Holocaust reduces it to some series of repeated historical events. What we thus achieve is to trivialize it and downplay it and deprive it of its unique stigma. Moreover, advocates of the thesis of non-comparability fall into a logical trap, because it is only by comparison that you can tell if an event is unique or not. Therefore, we have to compare. There is no escaping that. Importantly, however, we have to understand which characteristics of historical events are we comparing with one another. Are we going to be comparing the number of fatalities of terror in different countries, or provinces conquered by Nazi Germany? Or are we going to be comparing political motives of terror? Or are we rather going to be comparing the various forms and tools of Nazi terror leading to the Holocaust ultimately? This, however, is not the main subject of dispute. We are going to be focusing on historical comparisons with various murderous regimes that occurred in Europe alone so many times. Let us recall the slaughter of Muslims and Jews by the Crusaders. Let us recall the extermination of heretics, Cathars, Albigenses, Huguenots, by Orthodox Christians in France. The merciless pogroms of Jews in German cities let us mention the annihilation of Armenians by the Turks during World War I, etc. Our small continent has an extremely bloody history of tribal, ethnic, and religious conflict, time and time again leading yet again to explosions fueled by hatred. So why should we reject the right of comparing the effects of fanatical movements and murderous regimes with Nazi policy in its various guises? Nevertheless, researchers and authors of publications who do not resign from comparatistics expose themselves to the accusation that they are relativizing Nazi crimes and thus reducing the supposedly unmatched horror of the life and death of Jews under German occupation. We have to understand that the very fact of including Nazi crimes in a broader category called genocide does not suggest that we are trying to diminish them. On the contrary, such terminology immediately suggests the answer to the initial question about the uniqueness or typicality of the collective experience of several generations of European Jews. Here, that is in this part of Central Europe, the most important aspect and causing the greatest disagreement seems to be that comparing mass crimes of Hitler and Stalin and their regimes. The result of this gruesome rivalry depends on the actual criterion accepted. And yet I see nothing wrong in the simple posing of a question which clearly does not prejudge the answer. It greatly expands the field of historical observation. The question which the organizers of today's session asked us concerns the experience of European civilization. But we should try and think whether truly, in the 20th century and before, did we actually have something that we could refer to as a European civilization as a whole. Did it exist within its limits, and did it have its experience and its crises? Such a notion remains highly uncertain. Does not civilization stand for an ideal concept, hypothesis, a magic mountain? And if yes, what common experience and what ideals could be possessed by all those who have become acquainted with the concept in school books? Its meaning could be blurred or unclear, but as a rule, it was evaluated positively. European civilizational eras are usually characterized or described as the Enlightenment or the Western civilization or a Christian civilization, i.e., they are usually specified or described through the highest achievements in science, arts, technical skills, education, and customs. In a word, as a accumulation of cognitive, economic, ethical, and aesthetic values. And yet there is palpable falsehood in such interpretation of the concept. Humanity, represented by its intellectuals, flatters itself as if its history was the continuous growth of goodness, wisdom, and beauty. Such semantics tend to lose the dark side of human history as I see it. History which is full of intercommunal hatred and refined cruelty indeed. It is impossible to determine what prevails in the human condition because we have no measures of the standards of good or evil, even though we do have sufficient knowledge about the achievements of previous generations to horrify us. To horrify us what we, the people, are capable of. And whenever necessary, we are very, very good at justifying or even elevating the most horrific mass murders. For this reason, it will not be easy to declare whether with the passage of centuries the willingness and readiness increases in us to perform acts which recoil before our imagination. Maybe to the contrary. Has not the process of civilization that embraced Europe, specifically in the last millennium, relaxed customs and made it more difficult today than centuries ago to breach the natural barriers of fear and dread before inflicting physical pain and death on individuals of our own species? This, however, is a double-edged one, because if indeed such a barrier exists, it has been extremely weakened by modern techniques of mass execution by remote control. Ultimately, this means that murderers are deprived of visual contact with their victims. The technological argument is frequently cited to support the thesis about the uniqueness of the Holocaust. It is not fully convincing, however, because, as recent history proves, weapons used for the destruction of entire neighborhoods, wiping out the populations of villages and towns, are an easily portable gift of civilization, and it is really of secondary importance whether we're using a machine gun, a bomb, Zyklon B, or a machete. Ultimately, we should also consider the extent to which the extermination of Jews by the German Third Reich is unique in human history on the grounds that it was a planned ideological project rather than a spontaneous one, marked by tribal hatred that motivated the chain of events. In truth, however, all of the 20th century mass slaughters of Jews, infidels, members of other races or class enemies were realized wherever hateful crowd emotions were inspired and fueled by party, state, or church propaganda and legalization. These two factors, fanaticism and legalism, are mutually conducive. Widespread repulsive German anti-Semitism, as well as that of neighboring countries, inspired the military imperial aggression of Adolf Hitler and, sanctioned by laws, increased his power and respectability. Similarly, in communist Russia, the plebeian envy of those who had anything gained the support of the inexorable theory of history and state law. No feature taken by itself strengthens the belief in the utter uniqueness of the Holocaust phenomenon in the history of our continent. That is caused by a special conjunction of these conditions and their historical coincidence. Until now, we have not seen a mental vaccine preventing the recurrence of similar horrors. We have, however, learned that the philosophical and artistic culture of a leading European nation was not sufficient to ensure rejection and even gave up any resistance to being used in the service of a crime. The prematurely deceased Polish writer Tadeusz Borowski, an Auschwitz prisoner, wrote immediately after having been rescued, "We carry sacks of cement, lay bricks, railway tracks, put up boundary fences, trample on the ground. We build the foundations of some new monstrous civilization. Now I have got to know the price of antiquity. What a hideous crime the Egyptian pyramids, Greek temples, and statues are. How much blood must have flowed down Roman roads and embankments in the building of a city. Antiquity was a huge concentration camp where the slave was branded on the forehead and crucified for escaping." We should not be discouraged by the excessive rhetoric of these sentences. It would be difficult to ask for a more penetrating self-awareness of the ambivalence of European culture and yet its timeless unity. Such view was rather rare among surviving prisoners of Auschwitz or other camps and ghettos. Naturally, they were generally willing to acknowledge their experience as unique. And they also considered Germans as a nation which had forever tainted and disgraced Europe. Primo Levi, one of the most well-known analysts of the Auschwitz syndrome, gave a deeper reflection based on his personal experience and observation. I quote, "Up to the moment when I write this, despite the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the shame of the Gulag, the unnecessary and bloody war in Vietnam, the genocide in Cambodia, kidnappings in Argentina, and many cruel and unnecessary wars. The Nazi concentration camp system remains, despite all, something absolutely unique, a unicum with regard to both its size and its quality. Nowhere and never, in no other place and time, did one have to deal with such an unimaginable and complicated phenomenon. Never before was human life annihilated on such a huge scale, in such a short time, and by such a sober fusion of technological efficiency, fanaticism, and cruelty." Authors who, like Levi, regarded Nazi crimes as having no precedent in history, entangled themselves in a contradiction, since they wanted at the same time to remove from the Germans the odium of exclusive and terrible responsibility. There were arguments helping to escape the trap. Firstly, the replacement in descriptions and debates about the Holocaust of the Germans by the politically correct Nazis. This was generally successful in Western writings, but even today this is much more difficult in Polish, Russian, and, if memory serves, Hebrew literature and the media, to a great extent. Polish colloquial language had not created equivalent words to Nazis more Nazis, which sound unnatural in the Polish language. During occupation, the occupiers were sometimes referred to as Hitlerites, but mostly just Germans, and this is exactly how they are recalled in today's memories. The second evasive maneuver lies in the fact that one lumps together in one row the SS, the Gendarmerie, and the various murderous Sonderabteilungen or Einsatzkommandos. They are all feeding at the same trough, as are the more or less voluntary police formations composed of men recruited from populations of conquered countries or satellites, such as the French, Latvians, and Ukrainians. Such units, with a local population that was willing to collaborate with the occupying forces, played a truly bloody role in the extermination of Jews. The town of Jedwabne in northeastern Poland was a well-known example. Recalling such events continues to evoke strong resistance in societies that feel that they are being equaled with the perpetrators of the Reinhard Aktion. These embarrassing episodes of anti-Semitic motivation cannot be erased, albeit in the general plan of the Holocaust, they were but of secondary importance, and they in no way diminish the inspirational and leading role of the civilian, party, and military authorities of the Third Reich and their zealous implementers. It is not easy to assess whether the massacres and executions of Jews in earlier centuries were in their times proportionately less drastic than the Holocaust. Nevertheless, we have definitely been exposed to what Primo Levi described, and I do believe that the first European anti-Judaism should be mentioned, not to mention the fact that Jews were excluded from local societies. They were also accused of sacrilege and crime, not to mention the fact that all human solidarity bonds were severed. Pogroms and executions of Jews, were they less drastic than the Holocaust? That is not an easy task, nor is it an easy question. The gospel of love more than once obscured legalized acts of cruelty. In general, religious conflicts, crusades, and inquisitions were among the most ruthless events of European history. To close these considerations, we can conclude that wherever seeds of the ideology of anti-Semitism are sown explicitly and openly, especially where there is access to public education, the media, and instruments of investigation, there even a seemingly gentle society can be tamed with the view to repeat crimes against humanity. The Jews, for reasons of their conflict with the Christian sect, and then through their fragmentation and statelessness, became a very easy target for oppression. The list of potential victims is far from closed, and the list of oppressors, of potential oppressors, is not closed either. They will always be interested in increasing their role and their image of power. Thank you. I believe that we are now witness to a hugely important intellectual event or occurrence. I wish to remind you of the semi-century referring to the Holocaust, and also Friedender, who wrote of deliverance from anti-Semitism. And I believe that we have a plethora of such literature, and I further believe that Jerzy Jedlicki's essay or intervention is a very important contribution. I do not agree with the content, but that is a semi-private matter. Nevertheless, I do believe that it will definitely carry its repercussions in the form of debate. We are only left with 43 minutes, so probably we are going to move into, off-the-record conversations during the break. Now over to Karolina. Thank you very much, Paweł. A very warm welcome to you, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me to participate in this panel. I am accompanied by two great researchers, but also masters of the underground of the home seminar, i.e. unofficial institutions, which is now spanning several generations of Poles, supplementing their intellectual adventure at universities. Let me start with an anecdote, if I may. Several years ago, I held classes at the University of Warsaw, focusing on the memory and forgetting of post-Holocaust Jews. We were reading testimonies of living witnesses. A student approached me after the class was over, and he said, those books are very interesting. I cannot put them down, but could you please explain to me why it is that we are reading them? And that question by my student, who was deeply moved by these books, and nevertheless he did ask those questions, and I must say that This question has been accompanying me for many years. The question is hugely important. Why? Well, because if those who are examining post-Shoah memory are right, then it means that in 10 or 20 years we're not going to have any witnesses. All we are going to be doing is taking a closer look at showcased history, and it will not be able to be recreated. We will only be able to read testimonies. I'm going to return to that anecdote in closing because it contributes to the narration of what I wanted to tell you. In closing, Professor Jedlicki referred to the religious motive, asking the question what the anti-Judaism of Europe brings to us. Why is it important? That religious motive is very important. I know that Paweł Śpiewak, being a moderator, he cannot really develop his thought, but he wrote Shoah, the second falling. That was his paper, and in that paper he declared that the Holocaust referred or expanded to include those who were the first witnesses to God, which ultimately means that Holocaust is about deicide, which makes it unique. And that is a very important argument, and that argument was used by the Christian theorists of Holocaust. They were trying and are trying to interpret what was happening. Cardinal Ratzinger, when delivering his speech at Birkenau in 2006, used the same argument, which ultimately means that the Holocaust becomes proof of the very important role of the debate concerning the uniqueness of the Holocaust, or the lack thereof. Hence, I do believe that, instead of responding to the question whether the Holocaust is unique or not, we should be rather focusing on the importance of the debate concerning that uniqueness after 1945. The debate of whether the Holocaust was unique or not, in other words, the debate about the unforgivable after 1945, became a foundation, the very essence of the European project. The European Union has no origins without that dispute, without that debate. This dispute actually served to create an entire culture of European memory after 1945. Now, a lot suggests that we should be focusing on the Jewish nation and its condition today. A lot seems to suggest that the European project, with its memory and the Holocaust and the central location of the Holocaust, has now become a thing of the past. We can actually declare that the era of forgiveness or unforgiveness is a thing of the past. It is no longer there for a variety of reasons. We have three reasons for that state of affairs, and let me describe them to you. The first and obvious reason is the change of generations. How do we teach history to those who have not touched it themselves? That is question number one. They have not touched upon it, but possibly their families do have witnesses, be it victims or perpetrators or bystanders even. That would be much easier. How, therefore, do we teach new Europeans who arrive to us from different cultures, Muslims or the Chinese? That memory is not one of their families. Hence, the change of generations is the obvious and most clear reason for what was going on. That is not the only reason. The financial crisis is another one we should mention. The financial crisis has, ever since 2008, been introducing new passions to the political discourse. I will return to that one shortly. Nevertheless, it does happen that politicians who cannot manage their economy or labor policy or opportunities on the market of different social groups tend to blame different minorities for things that are happening, the Roma included. And the third reason will be one very difficult to describe over such short a time, but that involves changes to geopolitics. The policy of forgiveness existed in a bipolar world, with two centers only, two centers outlined by superpowers who could actually use nuclear weapons, who were in ideological conflict with one another. Today we are living in a multipolar world. Forgiveness, or lack thereof, has become a matter which takes place between two peoples, two groups, or two nations, whereas today geopolitics seem to suggest totally different solutions, and forgiveness, or the lack thereof, are simply not an option. All these reasons, those and a number of others, most probably, actually have caused Europe to be witness not necessarily to a radical change, radical syncretism, not necessarily memory or the lack thereof. What is it this syncretism all about? To put it very briefly, memory is selective. It applies to one group and it doesn't to another. We are still people who remember victims of the Stalin and Hitler regimes, so we do bear the victims of the totalitarian systems in mind. Nevertheless, we lack the same sensitivity with regard to groups who are our next-door neighbors. I mentioned the Roma already, but I do believe that European Muslims are another great example, and unfortunate example, and when I hear of anti-Semitic riots in different European cities, the same thing is brought to mind. We do pay homage to victims, and at the same time we tolerate and shut our eyes to anti-Semitic contemporary riots. Hence the question, what do we teach and why do we teach history at all? Entire generations learned and were taught history after 1945. Possibly history was not taught as it should have been. We do have a very simple answer here, that we are teaching history in order to learn sensitivity. In other words, our greatest challenge in contact with new generations. We should bear in mind that we should not be teaching them about things of the past, but sensitivity to things of the past. And that requires us to delve more deeply into the past and into our memories and the memories of others, regardless of whether we can understand those memories or not. And let me relate all that to Karski. It does seem to me that only provided that we actually work through individual biographies, can we actually attain a certain state or conditions when we can actually answer the question why to teach history. And I believe that Karski's biography is a great one here. So I believe that now we should start talking about how we are going to be teaching future generations. And I do believe that teaching through examples and biographies is going to be the most important task of all. Thank you very much. The fundamental problem when moderating such sessions always is that we have marvelous interventions, and here we had two marvelous interventions. Probably both of you would want to comment on the other's essay, hence I do not know whether any question of mine will bring us closer to the essence of the matter. Let me, however, ask those two questions. Professor Jedlicki said very explicitly that we cannot proclaim the Holocaust or Hurban and similar developments or horrible occurrences. That was commented on in the context of anti-Semitism. Let me ask the following question. Can we actually because I am an avid supporter of the belief that those occurrences were actually quite unique, as also emphasized by Primo Levi. I would like to ask Professor Jedlicki and Dr. Wigura, given the prism of history. Well, obviously, anti-Semitism has different faces in Poland and elsewhere. We do know that German anti-Semitism would not have happened without the many centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, don't you think that I'm going to be referring to Friedlander as an authority? Don't you believe that the Nazis brought a new phenomenon with it, selective anti-Semitism, with an emphasis on the religious dimension thereof? All of a sudden, anti-Semitism becomes the central point of Nazi beliefs, and freeing nations of Jews is not only a pragmatic project, as it was in the case of Turkey, and the removal of barriers. Without going into detail, the objective of murdering Jews was based upon specific objectives, and it was quite unique because it became non-pragmatic, it became purely ideological. Thus, we cannot imagine, we cannot even think of Shoah without the very, very strong or serious deliberation concerning the foundations of the phenomenon itself, as a factor of motivation. Not necessarily for individual murderers. That does not necessarily understand that all murderers understood what they were doing. Nevertheless, such was the basis of the entire endeavor. So cannot we declare at this point that the ultimate purpose of Shoah was not to deprive Jews of their property? That was of secondary importance. The point was not to deprive them of their territory. They didn't have a territory. The objective remained beyond any kind of logic which stood behind any war or any mass crime in our previous history. Even if we were to refer to the Bible, we do have the description of the extermination of the Canaanites, where men, women, and children, and trees are meant to be destroyed. Well, ultimately, the territory. But here, we take it beyond such material objectives. Don't you think that this is a signal telling us that our approach to the topic should be much more serious? We should move beyond suffering. We should move beyond the numbers of victims. We should focus on ideology, making the Holocaust unique. Should I speak as the last, or should we hand it over to the audience? Okay, so I understand that we should now collect other questions from the floor. And after we collect a number of questions, we will respond. We are pressed for time. We have 30 minutes, no more. I have two comments with a request to embark on it. I do believe that Bauer, who wrote that Shoah was not unique, it was without precedent. And I believe that this comment was actually a perfect response to whether Shoah was unique or not. This was also something that Professor Jedlicki referred to. That does not necessarily mean that it is not going to happen again. Nevertheless, I do believe, and here I agree with Dr. Wigura, is that the sense of the debate is not what we are discussing, but how and why. And I believe that, well, Henryk Grinberg when polemizing with Naukowska and her motto that people did that to people, polemized with that very correctly years ago. He declared that it was not about people who did it to other people, it was about people who did it to Jews. Jews were not picked by chance or at random. Hence, I would like to ask the two panelists whether you agree with the thesis that a subcutaneous, very important moment of this debate is that Europe is mad that Jews managed to have unprecedented genocide. Everybody wants their suffering to be recognized as Holocaust. There are very few debates where people would not be referring to the Holocaust of the unborn, the Holocaust of memory. Everybody is wildly jealous of Jews that they managed. As Golda Meir said, Germans will never forgive us. Jews, Auschwitz. I would like to quote John Gray, an English philosopher. He said something to the contrary to what Konstanty Gebert said, that we could never forget or forgive Jews for becoming victims. Dr. Sebastian Rejak of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also a PhD student of you, Professor, and this is my fundamental hat today, not a representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I would like to thank Professor Jedlicki. Professor, I do hope that your paper will be published. It is unprecedented in the context of Polish debates, be it historical or philosophical. It is not the first such comment in the Polish language. Nevertheless, it is absolutely the first to be thus formulated by a Polish researcher. In 2008, Alan Michman and Alan Rosenberg published experiments in thinking about the Holocaust with the Scholar Publishing House, and one of their essays focused on uniqueness. I must say that I found that essay fascinating intellectually, and I do believe that we could go on debating the topic. I also believe that it is not only about an obsession of Jewish researchers. In 1980s, the US published the ICARD's book, who suggests a thesis that the Holocaust was uniquely unique. And this is all in a nutshell, whether the Holocaust was unique or not. We have a fundamental question that we have to face, and it goes beyond the uniqueness dispute. I would like to mention a position of Peter Novick, a US historian, who, in his book, American, the Holocaust, published in the year 2000, commented on a couple of pages. So what if the Holocaust was unique? And that is my question to panelists. So, should we actually recognize that the Holocaust is or was a unique phenomenon, not only in terms of the trivial explanation that every historical occurrence is unique because it is unreplicable, but should we recognize the Holocaust's uniqueness? What kind of implications can that carry to any area of our lives? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those questions. Any other questions? Please introduce yourselves. Andrzej Kopczyński. I'm intrigued by the following question. How did it happen that such a great nation, who bred such great personalities as Goethe, for example, led to such tragedy, although Poland had its bloody history as well? Was it an impulse? Was it the spark set off by the leader? Or did actually Germans want to take revenge? Thank you. Professor Jan Grossfeld of the Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University, tutor of philosophy. A question to Dr. Wigura. You mentioned two things in a blend. Firstly, anti-Semitic riots in Europe, and a negative approach to Muslim minorities. Now, my first question is, who organizes those anti-Semitic riots in Europe? That is an important question, because it does seem to me that usually Muslim communities hold those riots. And that obviously causes a major problem in terms of accepting Muslim minorities on the one hand and blending the two on the other. Obviously, we should take care of minorities, but it is an issue. Professor Alexander Smolar needs no introducing. Eugeniusz Smolar's brother, Eugeniusz Smolar is the organizer of this session. The first question concerns the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Well, obviously, we should definitely refer to the crisis of Judaism. It is by no chance that Orthodox Jews refuse to accept the deification of the Shoah, because being chosen through evil can act as a substitute for being chosen through Jehovah, Yahweh. But on the other hand, we should also be suggesting other comparisons of communism and the Nazi, for example. Well, people like Raymond Aron, my teacher in France, rejected such theses, and he was neither a communist nor a crypto-communist. And Nolte, a very controversial German historian who was condemned. I understand the memories of Besançon. Is that what you're referring to? Well, both historians offer a similar thesis, namely that communism was a pathology, but it was based in enlightenment. And actually, Leszek Kołakowski wrote about it as well. So it was a pathology of humanist visions, whereas Nazism was a rejection of transcendence, not only of divine transcendence, but practical transcendence as well. Transcendence in the form of an enlightenment project. We should ask the question, what kind of world are we trying to build? And what kind of history and what kind of structures and world structures are we trying to introduce? Thank you very much. I understand that this question can also be radicalized. Jarosław Kuisz, the law department of the Warsaw University. I would like to ask the following question. Why should we teach, and how do we teach more and more frequently? Do I encounter a specific position in young people? Those young people are resistant to any conversation about the uniqueness of Holocaust on the one hand, but on the other, they are also opposing the very concept of blame being carried over from generation to generation. And that phenomenon is very interesting, because in such context, the education-related conversation encounters a barrier. And the following question, how long do we talk about it? And in that context, it would be very difficult to speak of responsibility or of blame, which is to be handed over from generation to generation. It is apparent that Europe, as Constante Gebert said, on the one hand, we do have a tendency to create victims at least comparable to Holocaust victims. That is on the one hand, and on the other, we do have tendencies to put such conversations on hold and to declare that this is a closed chapter of 2 or 3 generations' biographies. What about that? Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions?
ci potrzeba na odpowiedź na pytanie?
5 minut.
Karolinie 5 minut. Jedziemy, proszę bardzo. Zbigniew Nosowski.
Zbigniew Nosowski.
Proszę bardzo. Sorry, nie zauważyłem.
Nic nie szkodzi. Ja się nazywam Piotr Wróbel.
My name is Piotr Wróbel. I work at the University of Toronto.
I chciałem zadać takie pytanie zmierzające w kierunku globalnym.
I would like to ask a rather global question, or globalizing question, if I may.
W wykładach, które prowadzę, czy na niektórych seminariach, które prowadzę,
It does happen
większość moich studentów to są
that
Chińczycy.
the majority of my students tend to be Chinese, at least in some classes that I teach.
Profesor,
And what they say is,
jesteśmy
Professor,
zabijani od
we
końca
have
XVIII
been slaughtered
w ogromnych
since
liczbach. Sama
the late 18th century.
naprzód 40 milionów ludzi i tak dalej, i tak dalej.
40 million people
Europejczycy ciągle
altogether.
mówicie o tym Holokauście.
Why do you Europeans
Wyjątkowy i ważniejszy niż cokolwiek
tend to go on and on about the Holocaust, and you believe it to be the most important thing of all,
Więc
since we have global problems which are much more important? My question would be, how do we reach non-Europeans
widzenia,
whose perspective is totally different, whose outlook is totally different? How do we convince them
europejskie sprawy
that our European matters, our European questions are important as well? Thank you.
Pan Zbigniew Nosowski tam z tyłu.
Zbigniew Nosowski.
Redaktor naczelny
At the back,
miesięcznika.
the editor-in-chief of the Więź Monthly. I have a question to Karolina Wigura. When you offered your rather sad thesis that the era of forgiveness is a thing of the past, what I saw in my mind's eye was a couple of websites or portals who appeal for people to hate. Now they are going to say that even at the Karski conference, things were said proving that forgiveness is a thing of the past. I know that you are doing nothing but analyzing reality, so I do not have a problem with it. But yes, you were correct about teaching sensitivity through biographies. All right, so how do we teach forgiveness? Without forgiveness, our world will fall apart.
Bardzo ważne pytanie, trudne.
A very important and difficult question. Bogdan Białek, the editor-in-chief of the Charaktery periodical, but primarily he is a very important activist in terms of the Christian-Jewish reconciliation. He did a lot with his work to pay homage to 42 Jews who were murdered during the so-called Kielce pogrom. I must say that Paweł Śpiewak's words of introduction are much longer than the question I intend to ask of Dr. Wigura. I would like to refer to what your student asked. Why do we need to teach about the Holocaust? My doubt is as follows. Is that question valid at all? I also wish to refer to what Professor Wróbel said. I recall research carried out by a Krakowian professor of history who analyzed O-level exams. I don't remember the year, but that was a year when one of the main themes had focused on a book by Hanna Kral. And when analyzing these works by O-level students, was surprised to find that these pupils were actually quoting information that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising broke out in 1863, and so on and so forth. And it was then that he realized that the younger generations believe that the Holocaust carries the same historical importance as the Battle of Grunwald and is nothing but yet another date in our history. He also concluded that the Holocaust is understood as a collection of statistical data, which is also something that Professor Wróbel said. The extent of that tragedy can be expressed in numbers. Jan Karski, the patron of today's conference, was a great man. And he was great in that he was the first human being who understood Holocaust as going beyond numbers. He was the first to understand that the Holocaust was the deepest human crisis in history. Not even in the civilization that we can refer to as Judeo-Christian or European, but it was the very, very deep crisis of humanity. Hitler managed to redefine the term humanity. And actually, he managed to make that redefinition come true. Hence, my question would be, don't you think that we are falling into a trap asking some questions? For example, how and why do we teach Holocaust? Also in the context that you mentioned, Doctor, that witnesses are slowly passing. So how do we teach historical occurrence rather than an ethical fact? Any other questions? Because we should slowly draw to a close. We have so many questions that we should probably organize a major seminar to go on talking for months or even years. Another question. I'm very sorry, we have to close slowly but surely. Monika Mazurzak, Humanity in Action Poland. I have a question referring to a number of other questions. Quite an easy one to respond thus. Dr. Wigura said that in order to be efficient or effective in teaching history and in order to be able to teach future generations in the spirit of responsibility, we will have to convey historical knowledge in a specific manner in order to improve and increase young people's sensitivity. Does that mean that you are a supporter of such an educational model whereby history ought to be taught together with human rights? This is how I could understood it. This is how I could understand it. Obviously, we can ask the question, do we teach history, that's all? Or do we teach human rights, and that's it? Or do we teach both areas at the same time? I'm sorry, but we slowly have to come to a close. Dariusz House, representative of the world of art. I would like to emphasize that I was hugely impressed by the session. Nevertheless, I have two issues with it. I have an issue with the professor's intervention. I missed one very important element there. Legal responsibility, specifically in the context of international criminal law. We cannot forget that the Holocaust was a crime, and I believe that this crime ought to be punished, and this punishment ought to be enforced. Secondly, with regard to how do we teach history to younger generations, I believe that this is what the world of art should do. Good films, good books are something that can actually rekindle belief or trust in man, at the same time teaching younger generations what went on in the past. Thank you. Now I will hand over to my panel speakers. Karolina Wigura and Professor Jedlicki will be responding to all these questions, and they have approximately 6 minutes each. Thank you very much. Well, I thank you for all these questions. I do not know whether I will be able to respond to all of them. I was trying to show you or to prove to you that I would like to move out of the dispute about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, because I believe that once we do that, we can actually discuss Europe's present and future. I wanted to become the philosopher of politics. Nevertheless, you were coming back to the issue of uniqueness. Let me just say a couple of words about the uniqueness or not. Well, Shalini Randeria, the new rector of the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, was speaking in this very hall not long ago. And she was describing her perspective of Europe and her liberal democracies from the viewpoint of the Hindi culture. And she said that when Europe was learning about human rights and respect for them, colonies ruled by Europeans were territories where human rights were broken every day. So, trying to respond to whether the Holocaust is unique or not, from the civilization viewpoint, I must say that I had never been courageous enough to respond. I don't know, but from the viewpoint of the European project after 1945, it is definitely true that the heart of darkness was brought to the very heart of this continent and its culture. That is true, and that goes without saying. If I may, I believe that it would be worth our while to also refer to Mr. Białek's question, if I may. The question was that this ideology and project of murder had encountered something absolutely unique, and that is pendant to what Professor Wróbel said, that a group of people was meant to be removed from the realm of humanity. The sentence phrased here, it was uttered. Could you refer to it? I believe that this is one of the strongest arguments of all. Why? Because we are brought from the level of nationality to the level of religion. And I believe that such an image of Christian Europe damaging Judaism is very important. It was also hugely controversial because whenever Christian theologists try to interpret the Holocaust as Good Friday, Jewish theologists have a problem with it. And they are correct in that, because Good Friday, while terrible, had Sunday to follow. So that is a question, that is an answer to the question. Well, not really mine, it was Mr. Białek's question. Well, you are a specialist in the area of unforgiving and the science of forgiving. And Mr. Nosowski asked a related question. To paraphrase the question, are there any crimes that go beyond forgiveness? Don't you think that this uniqueness, this is what many claim, for example, the very well-known book, Punishment and Crime, refers to it, to that thesis, which ultimately means that the perpetrators have actually moved beyond Christian culture, having committed their crimes. Yes, I do believe so. I do believe that the Holocaust is an unforgivable crime, for a variety of reasons, simple ones included. Well, you cannot forgive a crime, the victims of which cannot forgive because they are no longer with us. But also, we should also ask the question whether the era of forgiveness is over or not. Can we continue teaching forgiveness? There is a story that I can recall. Vladimir Jankelevich was one of the greatest philosophers of forgiving and unforgiveness. He wrote an essay which is very bitter towards Germans. He compared forgiving Germans to casting pearls before swine, and that is one of the most bitter utterances about forgiveness that I had ever heard. And actually, he was then approached by a young German who had no wartime memories of his own, because he was born after the war, and Raveling asked Jankelevich whether can they actually be forgiven. Raveling was also a musician, and Jankelevich was also a musician. He was a piano player, so they played the piano together. That was not forgiveness. That was not an act of forgiveness. Well, Raveling was not to blame, so it was not forgiveness. But they did what Hannah Arendt refers to as casting a bridge over the burden of the past. They reconciled themselves to one another and the past. So possibly we should stop thinking about forgiveness, because the window of forgiveness was shut for a variety of reasons. And now, how do we teach it? I would like to come back to my student's question. One of you asked whether that student's question was adequate or appropriate. Why do we teach? Why should we teach testimony of Holocaust? I must say that students' question is always the best. We should never abandon or forsake them. Well, I do believe that the sensitivity I mentioned before goes beyond understanding and placing ourselves in the shoes of the victim. People who spent a lot of time with Shoah witnesses know that the reader wants to identify him or herself with the victims, and I don't think that this should be the deep understanding of what was going on. If we are to teach those students what the Holocaust means, we should cause that student to stop and think what would happen to him in order for him, the really nice guy, to turn into a Nazi executioner. So it is about deep self-analysis. What had to happen to regular family fathers to go and work at Holocaust camps? And that was a question asked by Hannah Arendt. It is a very deep question, and I do believe that this is the most difficult question to any great teacher. I can say that because I have two great teachers here, and they probably can, but I don't think that many people can. And one or two other things. The wild jealousy? Kostek, you asked whether that triggers wild jealousy. I don't think that this is so. What I think is that memory after 1945 became very, very important, not because wild jealousy of Jews. I do believe that in this rootless world of the second half of the 20th century, people are seeking identity. Memory proves a great answer to the process of seeking identity. We have all become rootless in the wake of the 20th century. And secondly, I do believe that for the first time in our history, we have been given the opportunity of encountering micro-history. Never before did we have so many testimonies. And I believe that on the centenary of the outbreak of World War I, it turned out that we have very few letters written by soldiers or their diaries. And all of a sudden, we have ended up with a plethora of testimonies in the wake of World War II. So it is not about wild jealousy, although possibly some of it is there. Last but not least, I have a question that I found really curious. Professor Grossfeld asked a question concerning those young Muslims who organize anti-Semitic riots. Yes, I can respond. But I wish to warn you that I did not really think this through. I'm now working upon the following question. How did it happen that the FPÖ in Austria and similar, once those states began aspiring to the European Union, those parties changed their anti-Semitic rhetorics to anti-Muslim rhetorics? That is fascinating. And the scheme, the pattern keeps repeating itself. FPÖ is a great example. 15 years ago or 20 years ago, they were anti-Semitic. Now they are anti-Muslim or anti-Islamist. Same thing goes for France, and that's a very interesting phenomenon. It is not obvious. I have not thought that through. That is just a question. Don't you think that those anti-Semitic riots, if they are organized by young Muslims, don't you think that they are actually anti-European? Don't you think that they are anti the European project? This is just a question. I cannot offer any firm conclusion. Well, thank you very much. I thank you as well. Now we will hand over to Professor Jedlicki. I wish to emphasize that Eugeniusz Smolar let us go in terms of our time management. He gave us another 7 or 8 minutes. Thank you very much for that. I do not wish to claim to be a specialist on the topic that I delivered my intervention on today. The question about the uniqueness of the Holocaust had been tormenting me for ages, and it seemed quite natural for me to comment on it today, but I was never a scholar of the subject. Nonetheless, I believe that the topic of uniqueness is very important. I understand that my young colleague here wants to go beyond the outline of that debate. Well, I wish to comment, let's say, as an outsider. I believe that this debate is very important. It is deeply material, and I do believe that we are going to be struggling with it for many years to come. Well, maybe me not, but you, ladies and gentlemen, yes, indeed. That leads to very serious consequences concerning human nature. That leads to deliberations concerning certain psychological features of the species that we are part of. And that species is going to be entirely different. That species is going to be totally different and is going to be reacting differently if we conclude that such developments can recur, and we are going to be reacting differently once we conclude that the Holocaust was unique and that the set of circumstances was conducive to it. Ever since I began considering the subject, I began concluding that the arguments supporting the uniqueness of Holocaust were very weak. I do not wish to dismiss them. What I wanted to do is to table the rationale of both parties, of both sides, to the extent that it can be done over the span of 15 minutes. I wanted to present arguments of both parties to the conflict, and when writing my paper, I was not sure of my conclusion. It had seemed to me before that the arguments against the thesis of uniqueness were more convincing to me. Nevertheless, until the very end, I was trying to present and to describe the conflict in an anonymous way, not quoting any authors with two exceptions. I simply wanted to describe a dispute which will go on and on, as many other disputes did in the course of our history. History is a science which does not necessarily lead to conclusions. In fact, it is quite natural not to reach conclusions. Historians keep going back to their motives, to their themes. Historians write work upon work about the French Revolution or the Crusaders or the Holocaust, and then they are followed by other historians who shed different lights on the same subjects. History does not offer ultimate or final conclusions, which would go beyond pure fact. I do believe that this is an example, that the Holocaust is an example of a development that will never ever invite ultimate conclusions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jerzy, for coming here. Karolina, thank you. Paweł, thank you for chairing this meeting. Now we shall break for 1 hour for lunch. Please come back on time. I would also want to welcome Professor Adam Daniel Rotfeld, who has joined us here and who will be part of our final panel. I do hope that we are not going to have more panelists than listeners here in this hall, but I would like to use this opportunity to thank the 3 ladies from the Jan Karski Foundation who joined me in preparing this conference together with the magnificent team of the Museum of Polish History. Thank you very much.